Hi, everyone. My name is Peter, and I'm here with the members of Group 1, Dixia, Heresies, Michelle, and Harleen, to discuss our findings and conclusion, whether or not Canada is guilty of genocide and its treatment of Indigenous people. Now, when most people hear the word genocide, they often think of some of the darkest events in human history, such as the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, or the Cambodian genocide. The word often suggests images of mass killings and atrocities that are universally condemned. So because of this, many Canadians that aren't familiar with the history with Indigenous people struggle to understand the idea of genocide could have occurred here. Although today Canada is often known for its celebration of multiculturalism, human rights, equality, Canada is absolutely guilty of genocide under the standards of international law. We will be providing specific case studies regarding residential schools, the 60 Scoop, and Indian hospitals to point to clauses of international law that Canada breached in its dark past. To understand why our group takes a stance, we need to first clearly define what genocide actually means. Again, many people mistakenly believe that genocide only refers to the mass killing of the population. And while this can certainly be an element of genocide, international law defines the crime much more broadly. Now, following the atrocities of the Second World War, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948. Article 2 of this convention defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. This term destroy here refers to 5 different identifiable acts that constitute genocide. These include number 1, directly killing members of the group. Number 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm. Number 3, deliberately creating living conditions intended to bring about the group's physical destruction. Number 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births. And number 5, forcibly transferring children from one group to another. Any one of these acts satisfies the legal definition of genocide outlined by the United Nations. We will be grounding much of our arguments in these 5 requirements. Since we have all learned throughout this class, many of Canada's policies align directly with the outlined criteria. Canada actually also accepted international legal obligations that bounded their responsibility to protect Indigenous children. In 1991, Canada ratified the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, agreeing to uphold every child's right to safety, family, culture, identity, and healthy development. However, one of the most devastating government policies affecting Indigenous children, the residential school system, continued to operate until 1996, just 5 years after Canada had legally committed itself to protecting those very rights. Now, this ironic contradiction questions how Canada can pledge to protect children while simultaneously operating institutions with the most assimilationist goals designed to separate Indigenous children from their families, languages, culture. Dictionary and Heresies will expand on this topic further, discussing how residential schools and the 60 Scoop not only directly meet the requirements of genocide, but also how its lingering impacts today contribute to the environment that brought about the group's destruction. Furthermore, Michelle will discuss the consequences of Indian hospitals and how their unethical treatment led to serious physical and mental harm for these populations. And finally, Harleen will wrap us up by exploring how these colonial policies have contributed to the disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous people today, demonstrating how the legacy of these policies ultimately continue to perpetuate cycles of genocide.
The Indian residential school system represents one of the darkest chapters of Canadian history. So, created with the purpose of assimilating Indigenous children into the Euro-Canadian society, these residential schools functioned from the late 1800s up until when the last school closed in 1996. These schools were funded by the government and were mainly run by the Christian churches, including the Roman Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church, and later the United Church as well. Now, they were initially promoted as being institutions to educate Indigenous children, but the real purpose was assimilation. Indigenous children were taken away from their families, separated from their culture, prohibited from speaking their own languages, and practicing their spiritual beliefs. And the sole purpose was just to assimilate them into this Euro Canadian society. Now, one might be thinking that if this was the case, then parents could have easily refused sending their kids to these schools, but no, that wasn't the case. There wasn't a real choice provided to these parents. If anyone refused sending their kids to these schools, they would have faced legal consequences, including fines or even imprisonment. Imagine being 6 or 7 years old and being separated from your parents, your siblings, from everything that is familiar to you, from being prohibited from speaking your own indigenous language. And if you did so, imagine being punished. You were slapped, kicked, dragged by the hair, have your mouths being washed out with soap, be forced to stand for long periods, or be beaten to the extent that you could not walk or have broken bones. Now, this isn't something that's just imaginary. This was the reality of for thousands of indigenous kids. Children were also punished for practicing their culture or spiritual traditions. They were expected to fully abandon their indigenous identity and follow Christian teachings instead. Many survivors have also described harsh discipline for minor mistakes, such as talking after lights out, or talking to their siblings, or not completing chores on time. And punishments included being beaten by rulers, by sharp objects, having meals withheld, or forced to perform exhausting manual labor as well. Now, according to the United Nations Genocide Convention, genocide is not limited to mass killing. It includes several acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And one of those acts is forcibly transferring children from one group to another, which is exactly what happened in this residential school system. So children were removed from their families and placed in these government-funded, church-run institutions. Also, the convention clearly defines genocide as causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group as well. So many of the children in residential schools experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse as well. Therefore, it is definitely safe to say that the residential school system was genocidal, and it constitutes as Canada committing genocide against Indigenous peoples.
Talking about the 60s scoop was a period from 1950s to 1980s when thousands of Indigenous children were taken away from their families by child welfare agencies. When residential schools began closing, another system started, which is removing large number of Indigenous children from their families. Instead of being sent to residential schools, they were placed in foster or adopted by mostly non-Indigenous families, often far away from their communities. Many of these adoptions were permanent, which meant children lost their legal connection to their families and communities. The government had already recognized in the 1940s that residential schools were not achieving their goal of assimilations. However, ending residential schools did not mean the goal of assimilation ended. Instead, the child welfare system became another way of Indigenous children separating from their families, culture, and communities. This led to what is known as the 60s scoop. The 60s scoop happened because the government believed Indigenous people needed to be changed and made follow European ways of life. Many parents who survived residential schools experienced trauma and lost their connection to their culture, family relationships, and parenting traditions. When social workers saw families struggling, they often viewed it as a neglect instead of understanding that these struggles were connected to the harm caused by residential schools. Many researchers describe the 60s scope as cultural genocide because thousands of Indigenous children were taken away from their families, causing them to lose their language, culture, identity, and connection to their communities. During the 60s scope, social workers played many major roles in removing Indigenous children from their families. So today they are encouraged to learn from Indigenous communities, work with elders, and provide care that respects Indigenous cultures and traditions. This issue is not just a part of the past. Between 2008 and 2015, the Truth and Reconciliations Commission heard stories from more than 6,000 residential school survivors and identified the residential school system as cultural genocide. It created 94 calls to action to address the harms caused. In 2000, 1921, the discovery of unmarked graves as the former Kamloops Residential School brought more attention to the painful history that Indigenous communities had been speaking for many years. In 2017, the Canadian government also reached an $800 million settlement with 60 scoop survivors. In 2016, a human rights tribunal found that Canada was unfairly underfunding child welfare services for First Nations children. To summarize, we can say that residential schools removed Indigenous children through the education system, while the 60s scoop removed children through the child welfare system, and both were connected to efforts to separate the Indigenous children from their families and cultures.
Apart from residential schools, another prominent institution operating under the same federal assimilation policy was Canada's segregated Indian hospital system. These hospitals were initially justified to isolate tuberculosis patients and were first established and run by Christian missionary groups in the late 1800s to early 1900s. Then around the 1920s, the federal government of Canada took over the operations. Indian hospitals remained active until 1981, but many of its traumatic effects still remain today. Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples in Indian hospitals aligns with multiple subsections of the United Nations 1948 Genocide Convention for what is constituted as genocide. Article 2C talks about inflicting conditions of life that are meant to bring about the physical destruction of the targeted group. More often than not, Indigenous people were admitted to these hospitals according to their Indian status rather than disease or medical necessity, and many were forcibly removed from their homes. These hospitals were underfunded, understaffed, overcrowded, and poorly maintained, which increased disease spreading and mortality among patients. People were also restricted from leaving, especially after an amendment to the Indian Act in 1953, which made it a crime to refuse a hospital visit or to leave before being discharged. Many children also experienced what staff jokingly termed castitis, where plaster casts would be put on both of their legs with a connecting bar in between to stop them from running around. Related to this is Article 2E, which is about forcibly transferring children. Indian hospitals were closely tied to residential schools, with some hospitals even being in the same buildings as the schools. In Indian hospitals, children who began recovering were often sent to residential schools rather than being allowed to return home. These two systems, working together, continued to cut children off from their families, communities, and cultures. Indian hospitals also routinely engaged in birth apprehensions, where newborns were taken away from their mothers. Although birth apprehensions or birth alerts have been recently banned, they still occur informally, contributing to the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in foster care. Another routinely performed procedure in Indian hospitals was forced or coerced sterilizations on Indigenous women, which aligns with Article 2D of imposing measures intended to prevent births. Patients were often forced to sign consent under vulnerable states, like during child labor or when they were heavily medicated. Some were also told that this birth control was reversible when it was not, and some were not informed of the procedure at all. These procedures are also still around, with there being cases at least as recent as 2022. Lastly, Article 2B mentions serious bodily or mental harm. Even though these hospitals did successfully treat some patients, there was quite widespread substandard care, physical abuse, and medical experimentation. Apart from the examples I've already mentioned, there was also non-consensual nutritional experiments, clinical trials for new medications or vaccines, and testing of unnecessary lung surgeries, which included removing ribs or procedures that were meant to collapse patients' lungs. For many patients, they only received local anesthetic for these invasive surgeries instead of the standard general anesthesia procedure. Now, technically, some of these procedures, like using casts for immobilization to get more bed rest, or thoracic surgeries, were originally justifiable for the treatment of tuberculosis. But the issue in Indian hospitals was that there was prolonged use of these measures even after effective antibiotics became available. So in the late 1940s and 1950s, non-Indigenous patients began receiving outpatient antibiotic care and could quickly return home. But during the same time, there was actually rapid expansion of the Indian hospital system. And so the government thought Indigenous peoples were incapable of managing their own health. So all these experiences combined, it is not difficult to see why there may be intergenerational trauma and distrust towards the healthcare system and government institutions from Indigenous peoples. Plus, Indigenous peoples still experience lots of discrimination today, especially in healthcare, where staff just assume that any symptoms they present with are due to intoxication. And next I'll pass it off to Harleen.
Another important way to examine whether Canada committed genocide against Indigenous peoples is by looking at Canada's correctional system today. While incarceration itself is not listed as an act of genocide under the United Nations Genocide Convention, many scholars argue that the justice system demonstrates how the effects of colonialism continue long after the original policies ended. In other words, if colonial policies had truly ended without lasting consequences, we would expect Indigenous peoples to experience similar outcomes to the rest of the Canadian population. However, that is not what we see. According to the Office of Correctional Investigators' 2023-2024 annual report, Indigenous peoples make up only about 5% of Canada's population, yet they account for more than 35% of the federal prison population. Even more concerning is the situation for Indigenous women. Although Indigenous women would make up only a small percentage of Canada's female population, they now represent over half of all federally incarcerated women. The report also notes that these numbers have continued to increase over the past 2 decades despite repeated government commitments to reconciliation and criminal justice reform. These statistics are supported by Statistics Canada. In its 2026 report on the overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black adults in custody, Statistics Canada found that Indigenous adults are incarcerated at rates many times higher than non-Indigenous Canadians across almost every province and territory. For example, in Saskatchewan, the incarceration rate for Indigenous adults is more than 20 times higher than the rate for non-Indigenous adults. British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and several other provinces show similar patterns. Although the exact numbers vary, this tells us that Indigenous overrepresentation is not a problem in one province or one community, but instead it's a national issue. So why does this matter when we're discussing genocide? Well, in The Colonial Problem, an Indigenous Perspective on Crime and Injustice in Canada by Lisa Monchalin, she argues that these incarceration rates should not be interpreted as evidence that Indigenous peoples commit more crime. Instead, she argues that the Indigenous justice system continues to reflect colonial structures that have existed for generations. She explains that many of the conditions associated with incarceration, such as poverty, unstable housing, addiction, limited educational opportunities, and discrimination, all themselves are products of colonial policies rather than individual failures. In other words, the justice system often responds to the consequences of colonialism instead of addressing their root causes. The Department of Justice Canada also recognizes that Indigenous peoples continue to experience unequal treatment through the criminal justice system. Indigenous accused are more likely to be denied bail, spend longer periods in pretrial detention, receive custodial sentences rather than community-based alternatives, and face barriers to successful reintegration after release. These patterns only show that inequality is present at multiple stages of the justice process, not only after someone has been convicted, but from the very beginning of their interaction with the justice system. Another important source is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. In 2015, the Commission issued several calls to action specifically aimed at reducing the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in custody. The Commission argued that meaningful reconciliation cannot occur while Indigenous peoples continue to experience such unequal outcomes in Canada's justice system. More than 10 years later, however, the statistics remain extremely high. This raises an important question. If reconciliation has become a national priority, why have these numbers continued to increase? This brings us back to our main question. Did Canada commit genocide against Indigenous peoples? Legally, incarceration alone does not satisfy the definition of genocide under the United Nations Genocide Convention. However, I believe it provides powerful evidence that the consequences of colonial policies have never truly ended. The policies discussed by my group members, such as residential schools and other forms of forced assimilation, were designed to disrupt Indigenous communities. Today, incarceration continues to disproportionately separate Indigenous people from their families, communities, and cultures. While the institutions have changed, many of the outcomes remain strikingly similar.
So, to conclude, we can say that residential school system was definitely not an isolated event. They were part of a much broader system. The 60s scoop continued the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families. Indian hospitals subjected many Indigenous peoples to segregation, neglect, and non-consensual medical treatment. And the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in Canada's justice system reflects the long-term consequences of these policies and all the systemic inequalities that they created. Now, when we look at all these events individually, they're devastating, but when we look at them together, we notice a clear pattern. They all targeted Indigenous peoples in ways that they separated families, erased cultures and languages, and caused serious physical and psychological harm. And not only that, they undermined the survival of Indigenous communities as a whole. For these reasons, we believe that Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples amounts to genocide. Recognizing this history is not about assigning any blame to people today. Rather, it is important to acknowledge the truth, learning from it, and supporting meaningful reconciliation so that these injustices are never repeated ever again. Thank you.